Hello everyone, this is Iran Talk, and in this video I'd like to revisit the Afghan problem. In other words, the primary objective of this analysis is to show that the Afghans are very ungrateful towards Iranians and actually despise Iranians. Before I proceed any further, I'd just like to say that Afghans are no friends of Iranians and actually do not like Iranians and would rather leech off the Iranian nation instead of rebuilding their own country, which is currently in ruin. The majority of Afghans today harbor some sort of grudge towards Iranians and tend to blame Iranians for nearly all their troubles, whereas the reality is the Afghans are the main problem in Iran today and they're currently causing a lot of issues. In fact, I've covered the Afghan problem in previous videos, so if you're interested, please do check them out. While I do not call for violence against the Hazara people, I think that a stance amongst the Iranian populace must be taken against these invaders. Ever since the Taliban takeover, the Hazaras have been flooding Iran and actually have caused a lot of problems for the indigenous Iranians. Now, many of you may think just because the Hazaras speak an Indo-Iranian, particularly an Iranian language, they should be considered as Aryan or Iranian as any other, but as my genetic analysis later in this video will prove, the Hazaras are completely foreign genetically to Iran and should be expelled from Iran immediately. The Hazaras are causing a lot of problems for Iranians just as they have done so in Afghanistan itself. Now, in response to the video, one of the commenters wrote, "We built their country, that's what we've done. Time to build our own so our people don't have to go and work for these types of Cosmodar Nasl Sega cars, inshallah." As you can see, this individual is very much anti-Iranian and has animosity towards the Iranian people, going as far as claiming that the Afghans built Iran. Now, this could not be further from the truth, as the Afghans have done little to better the lives of Iranians throughout history and actually have been detrimental to the Iranian people. This comment also highlights the animosity that Afghans harbor towards Iranians, especially their anti-Iranism from the core of their hearts and souls, as they despise Iranians to a great extent and do not support Iranian nationalism or consider themselves to be Iranians in any way and are only in Iran to leech off of the Iranian government and the Iranian people. Now, many of you may be sympathetic to the Hazaras, but ask yourself, is it right to let in millions of these invaders into the country who are then used by the regime to further their goals and interests against the Iranian people? For this reason, the Hazaras are a fifth column within Iranian society and are only there to further the interests of the regime. Up next, I will be taking a look at how the Afghan Pashtuns and Hazaras have been historically detrimental to Iran and Iranians. Now, without further ado, I'd like to begin the analysis. Up first, we have this image of Afghan Pashtuns, and you can see that they have a very Asiatic, particularly a South Asian phenotype, and they do not resemble modern day Iranians, and this is especially due to their heavy South Asian influences. Here is another image of the undesirable Pashtuns, and once again you can see that they have a very Asiatic shift and clearly do not resemble Iranians, but rather, due to their heavy South Asian ancestry, they resemble some sort of Asiatic population. Thus, the Pashtuns are indeed not Iranians. Now, amongst the Pashtuns, one of Iran's greatest enemies was Mahmud Hotaki. In fact, this man was responsible for the fall of the Safavid dynasty and nearly a decade of ruin and despair for Iran and Iranians. In fact, Eugene Flandin visited Isfahan after this event, and you can see this is the image that he sketched, and clearly Isfahan was no longer the center of intellect and achievement as the Afghans completely ruined the city and left it in a state of decline. Now, here is a map of the Hotaki dynasty, and you can see that it stretched all the way from western Pakistan to Shiraz, Isfahan, and Tehran in Iran. Despite the Hotaki realm not encompassing all of Iran, what's evident is that nonetheless this so-called empire was detrimental to the development of Iran. more than a decade after the Hotaki invasion of Iran, in which many Iranians died, especially nobles who were murdered by the Hotakis. Nadir Shah, the leader of the Afsharid clan, invaded Afghanistan and reduced Kandahar to rubble. I will also say that Nadir Shah is the reason that Iran today is still Iranian genetically and ethnically and also culturally, and does not have much to do with Afghanistan, as if had the Afghan occupation of Iran continued, it's likely that the Iranian identity would have been significantly eroded. Up next, I'd like to take a look at the genetic origins of the Pashtuns. And before I do that, here are just the source populations, and you can see that there's a Yamnayan component. So this is the Proto-Aryan component. There's a Neolithic Iranian component, an Anatolia Neolithic component, a Caucasian hunter-gatherer component, an Natufian component, an India Neolithic component, which is made up of the Shakrisok, the Bronze Age sample, though I feel that this sample is very close to Neolithic South Asians. Then there's also a Siberia Neolithic component, a Morocco Neolithic component, and an Ethiopia Neolithic component. All of these components will be utilized to assess the amount of ancestry the Afghan Pashtuns derive from each of these source populations. Here are the autosomal results for the Pashtuns, and these are from all across Afghanistan. I should also mention that I did not include any Pakistani Pashtuns in these calculations. You can see that the Afghan Pashtuns are on average 29.4% Yamnayan, 26.9% India Neolithic, so significant South Asian ancestry, 26.2% Iran Neolithic, 13.6% Anatolia Neolithic, 3.4% Siberia Neolithic, and 0.6% Caucasian hunter-gatherer. What these results prove is that on a genetic level, the Afghan Pashtuns are heavily admixed with South Asians, and they also have a bit of Siberian ancestry as well. And what's interesting to note is that their South Asian ancestry is nearly 10 times as high as is found in Iranians, in some cases even higher than that, which is very interesting. So what this means is that on a genetic level, the Pashtuns are significantly admixed with South Asian population, and for this reason they cannot be considered to be Iranians. Thus, these results prove the Asiatic origins of the Pashtuns and their foreignness to Iran and Iranians. So while they do have significant Yamnayan ancestry at 29.4%, they nonetheless have significant South Asian ancestry, which pulls them away from modern-day Iranians. Because of their historical animosity and their genetic irrelatedness to modern Iranians, the Pashtuns should not be welcomed into the country, and that's, I think, the policy of the current Iranian regime. Though nonetheless, I could be wrong, as most Pashtuns tend to go to Pakistan and do not come to Iran. Nonetheless, the Afghan Pashtuns are indeed a threat to the Iranian people and the Iranian nation. Despite this, however, the Pashtuns are not the greatest threat to the Iranian people coming from Afghanistan. The greatest threat to Iran from the country of Afghanistan actually comes from the Hazara people. In fact, the Hazaras pose a major challenge to the Iranians, and next I will get into their history as well as their genetic origins. Now here is an image of Hazaras in Afghanistan, and you can see that they have a very Asiatic look, and this is primarily due to them descending in part from the Mongol invaders. Here are the Hazara women, and you can see again they have very Asiatic features and not Iranic features, and what this means is that they're not fully Iranian, and as you'll see they have significant East Asian and Mongolian ancestry. Now, while the Hazaras may deny their ancestors were the Mongols, then you can see with this image, the Mongol invaders are depicted as being very East Asian-like. Here is another image, and you can see that the Mongols are an Asiatic people that are completely and entirely foreign to Iran and Iranians. As many of you may know, the Mongols invaded Iran at the peak of Iranian civilization during the medieval period under the Khwarezmians and ravaged Iranian Central Asia as well as parts of the Iranian plateau. These invasions ultimately culminated in the deaths of nearly 5 to 20 million Iranians, particularly those of the urban centers, and led to the depletion of the Iranian population in Central Asia. Thus, the Mongols were definitely and most certainly true enemies of Iranians, and their massacre and bloodlust for the Iranian people knew no bounds. And you can see this happening today with the descendants of the Mongols, particularly the Hazaras, invading Iran en masse. For this reason, I hope Iranians have learned that the Mongols were never friends of Iranians, and their descendants, the Hazaras, are not friends of Iranians either, and are only in Iran to leech off of the Iranian people. And as you'll see next, their genetics are completely alien to Iran and Iranians. And here are the results for the Hazaras. So you can see they're on average 40.4% Siberia Neolithic, which is East Asian ancestry, 23.0% Yamnayan, 15% India Neolithic, 11.0% Iran Neolithic, and 10.6% Anatolia Neolithic. What's evident from these results is that the Hazaras have very little Iranian ancestry, and they're mostly of East Asian descent, and you can see that their Yamnayan ancestry is only at 23% and their Neolithic Iranian ancestry is only at 11%. Thus, these results prove that the Hazaras are a mongrelized population. In fact, the Iranian Arabs from Khuzestan as well as the Turkmen from northeastern Iran are more Iranian than the Hazaras, which is very interesting. And what this means is that the Hazaras have no place in Iran and should be expelled immediately, even before the Pashtuns are expelled. And this is the point of my argument here. I feel that the Hazaras pose a major genetic and cultural as well as religious threat to Iranians, as most Iranians today are secular, whereas the Hazaras are hardcore Islamists. The radical tendencies of the Hazaras are what have led them to be utilized by the Iranian regime against the Iranian people. In fact, there are historical tensions between the Hazaras and the Pashtuns, as in the late 19th century, Abdurrahman Khan, the ruler of Afghanistan, killed nearly 60% of the Hazara population of Afghanistan. This massacre was done because of tensions between the Hazaras and the Pashtuns, and as someone who cares about Iran, I do not want this sort of inter-ethnic Afghan rivalry to come to Iran, and I do not want there to be gang wars on the streets of Tehran or any other Iranian city between the Hazaras and the Pashtuns. Both of these populations are hostile to Iran and the interests of Iranians, and thus they should be barred from entering the country. The only Afghan population who has some ties to Iran are the Tajiks, and I will get into their history and their genetic origins next. It's also worth mentioning that unlike the Pashtuns and Hazaras, the Tajiks are much more cultured and much more ethnically compatible with Iran and Iranians. Though some Tajik populations are virtually indistinguishable genetically from the Pashtuns. I reckon this is because some Pashtuns were assimilated by the historical Persian-speaking elites of Afghanistan. Here is an image of Afghan Tajiks, and you can see that they have a very Pashtun-like phenotype. In contrast, here are Tajiks from northern Afghanistan from the region of Badakhshan, and you can see that they have a very Iranian phenotype, and you can see very little Asiatic and South Asian influences. Historically, the Badakhshan region was part of the Bactrian civilization and culture, and you can see this is a map which does well to reflect the overall territorial expanse of the Bactrians, and you can see they were part of western Tajikistan, southeastern Uzbekistan, and northeastern Afghanistan. Now, the reason I brought up the Bactrians is because there are Afghans from this region who have a very Aryan profile and are not akin to the other admixed populations of Afghanistan. Here are the results for the first of the Afghans that I wanted to take a look at here. So these are regional Tajiks from Kapisa and Panjshir. With these Tajiks, you can see that they're just assimilated Pashtuns, and they're on average 29.4% Yamnayan, 27.3% Neolithic Iranian, 24.2% Neolithic South Asian, 10.4% Anatolia Neolithic, 5.8% Caucasian hunter-gatherer, and 2.9% Siberia Neolithic. As these results prove, the Tajiks from Kapisa and Panjshir are assimilated Pashtuns, which is rather unfortunate, and their genetics also show a great degree of Neolithic South Asian ancestry. Despite some Tajiks being assimilated Pashtuns, there are legitimate and genuine Tajiks living in Afghanistan. These, as mentioned, are the Badakhshani Tajiks from northeastern Afghanistan. Here are the results for the Badakhshani and Takharian Tajiks, and they're on average 35.8% Yamnayan, 23.1% Iran Neolithic, 16.6% Anatolia Neolithic, 13.8% India Neolithic, 8.0% Siberia Neolithic, and 2.7% Caucasian hunter-gatherer. I reckon that these Tajiks are the direct descendants of the ancient Bactrians, as you can see only minimal South Asian influences, though the Siberia Neolithic component is elevated here. Nonetheless, these Tajiks have a very Iranian profile genetically, and if Iran is to let in any Tajiks, might as well let in those living in northeastern Iran, as they're the most persecuted and the most vulnerable. However, I am still opposed to the mass migration of any Tajiks or Pashtuns or Hazaras from Afghanistan. The last Afghan populations analyzed here are the Harati Tajiks as well as the Kizilbash. The Harati Tajiks are partially descended from Afghan migrants from Khorasan, as are the Kizilbash, and they're on average 31.3% Neolithic Iranian, 25.3% Yamnayan, 19.8% Anatolia Neolithic, 14.5% India Neolithic, 5.8% Siberia Neolithic, and 3.3% Levantine Natufian. What these results prove is that there are still salvageable populations living within Afghanistan who have a largely Iranic profile. And despite their South Asian ancestry being quite high, it's still nonetheless very low compared to the Pashtuns, the assimilated Tajiks, as well as the Hazaras. Thus, there are certainly Tajiks who can migrate to Iran and who can blend in with the Iranian population without being very detrimental to the culture as well as the genetics of the Iranian people. However, I do feel that these Tajiks should only be let in on a humanitarian basis and not on any other reasons. Now, many of you may be wondering how these Pashtuns, Hazaras, and Tajiks compare to modern day Iranians as well as the ancient Iranians, and I will be taking a look at that next. Now, here is a map of the Aryan migration to Iran. As you can see, the homeland of the Iranians was in Central Asia, and these ancient Iranics migrated to southern and northwestern Iran as well as other parts of the plateau, but the two main ancient Iranian peoples descending from this migration were the Medians and the Persians. And as is evident from this map, the homeland of the Aryans was in the Yaz culture, which was descended from a hybrid population of Andronov steppe pastoralists and indigenous Iranian Bmak farmers. The Bmak culture was of course the predecessor of the Yaz culture. BMAC is just an acronym for the Bactria Margiana Archaeological Complex. The hybridization between the BMAC farmers and the incoming Proto-Indo-Iranians was attested to in a 2022 study titled Genetic Continuity of Indo-Iranian Speakers Since the Iron Age in Southern Central Asia. What was concluded in the study is that the likely ancestors of the Medians and the Persians were on average 43% BMAC and 57% Andronovo. Here are the G25 results for the ancient early Iranians, and you can see they're on average 56.6% Yamnayan, 24.8% Iran Neolithic, 17.2% Anatolia Neolithic, 0.8% Siberia Neolithic, 0.4% Morocco Neolithic, and only 0.2% India Neolithic. Thus, with these results, you can see that the early Iranians were very distinct from the Afghan Pashtuns as well as the Hazaras and Tajiks, and for this reason the claim made on the Reddit post that I shared earlier that Afghans built Iran is untrue. In fact, the early Iranians migrated to Iran and mixed with the native population to form the Persians and the Medians. And this is especially evident from the depictions created by the ancient Persians at Persepolis. Here you can see that these are ancient Persians and they have a very Iranian phenotype, and you can see that their features are very distinct from modern day Afghans. And with this next image you can see that there was variation amongst the ancient Iranics who lived in Iran. So you can see that to the left you have a very typical Persian profile, whereas to the right you have a more steppe influenced individual, and both of these would be Persians and they would serve under the Persian Empire equally. What this means is that the ancient Persians and Medians were very diverse. Nonetheless, they had overarching Iranian features which are very distinct from the Afghan features I presented early on in this analysis. And here is an image of modern Iranian women, and you can see that the diversity is still there, though nonetheless there is a bit of uniformity. Here is another image of modern day Iranian women, and once again you can see that they have a very Iranian phenotype, and South and East Asian influences are at a minimal, which is not the case with the Afghan Tajiks, Hazaras, and Pashtuns. And here is an image of a modern Iranian alongside a recreation of Cyrus the Great, and you can see very Iranic features and not South Asian or East Asian influenced features. And here is another image of a modern Iranian man being compared to a reconstruction of Papak, the ancestor of the Sasanians. And again, you can see very Iranian features with little South Asian and East Asian influences. Also, the Arab influences are at a minimal in both of these examples as well. Now here is an image of an Iranian woman, and you can see that she has a very Iranian phenotype and she matches perfectly to the image on the right. Here is another Iranian woman, and once again you can see very little South Asian, East Asian as well as Semitic influences and largely Iranic and Aryan influences. This is another comparison, and once again you can see a very Iranian phenotype. The second to last of these images compares Ardashir I and a reconstruction of him to a modern-day Iranian man, and you can see very little non-Iranian influences and the phenotype is remarkably similar. Here is the last of these images, and you can see a very Iranian phenotype, and this Lur individual matches perfectly with these two Achaemenid Persian guards. Thus, the continuity amongst modern-day Iranians is definitely reflected by phenotype, but up next I'll show that Iranians are not only phenotypically the same as the ancient inhabitants of the plateau, but they're also genetically very close to the population that resulted from the admixture between the ancient Aryans who migrated to Iran and the indigenous population of the Iranian plateau. Now, without further ado, I'd like to take a look at the genetic origins of modern-day Iranians. Please do, however, keep in mind that this analysis will not take a look at the genetic origins of modern-day Kurds and Azerbaijanis, as they are a bit more distinct from the general Iranian population. Here are the results for modern-day Iranian population. So you can see they're on average 37.0%, Iran Neolithic 27.4%, Anatolia Neolithic 17.5%, Yamnayan 9.3%, Caucasian hunter-gatherer 5.0%, Natufian 2.2%, India Neolithic, and 1.7% Siberia Neolithic. As you can clearly see, modern-day Iranians are very distinct from the Afghan Pashtuns as well as the Hazaras and also most Tajik populations. And what's critical to note is that the South Asian and East Asian ancestries are at a minimal. The South Asian ancestry is only at 2.2%, and in the majority of these samples it does not exceed more than 3.8%, with the two exceptions being the Eastern Iranians, including the Khorasanis. Nonetheless, even then, these results suggest that it's much lower than is found in the Afghans of today. And the Siberia Neolithic component is also at a minimal, only averaging 1.7% and not exceeding more than 3.8% in the Khorasani, but for the most part it does not exceed more than 2.8%. So what this means is that modern day Iranians have minimal East Asian ancestry. Thus, Iranians are very distinct genetically from the Afghan Pashtuns, Hazaras, and Tajiks. To conclude, I took a look at the disastrous impact of Afghan immigration to Iran culturally, historically, as well as genetically. I feel that Iran can survive this migration and mass deportations are needed of the Afghan population residing within Iran. Only after these deportations take place can Iran recover, and I think Iran can recover and Iran will recover. I also feel that the Afghans are causing a lot of problems for the indigenous Iranians, and these will only be rectified once the Afghans are expelled from the country. That is essentially it for this analysis. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe.